You are listening to American Ambassadors Live, the podcast on international affairs sponsored by the Council of American Ambassadors in Washington, D.C. The Council is the association of non-career U.S. ambassadors who have represented America under presidents from John F. Kennedy through Donald Trump.
Our guest today is Ambassador Ryan Crocker. Ambassador Ryan Crocker served as U.S. ambassador to 6 nations: Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Kuwait, and Lebanon, as both a career Foreign Service officer and as a non-career ambassador. He serves today, among other things, on the Afghanistan War Commission. Former President George W. Bush called him America's Lawrence of Arabia because of his extensive knowledge of the Middle East. Ambassador Crocker, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Jim.
So why don't we start with where we are right now? There is a raging war in the Middle East, as everyone in the world knows. What is your evaluation of it in terms of the short term? For example, there are questions: can Israel actually destroy Hamas? Will the Arab nations keep trying to bring about peace? Will the Netanyahu government survive? Let's just start with all those immediate questions.
I think where we have to start is with October 7th. The extraordinary violence and the death toll in Gaza since the beginning of Israeli operations, I think, has somewhat obscured the horror of that day. 1,200 Israelis were killed in one day. And just by way of comparison, during Israel's 18-year occupation of Lebanon, they lost 1,100 troopers. Up through October 6th, that was considered an unacceptable toll. Well, that toll of 18 years was exceeded in one day, and of course, it was largely not combatants who were killed.
For sure.
Civilians, women, and children. So the trauma of October 7 on Israel and Israelis cannot be underestimated or ignored. That is not to suggest that the awful toll in Gaza is not something we should all not be concerned about. We should.
Of course.
But the impact of October 7 on the Israeli psyche is profound, and it will have long-term consequences. In terms of the fight itself, you pose a great question. Can Israel succeed in a total victory over Hamas? In essence, they have 2 contradictory aims. 1, the elimination of Hamas, and 2, the return of all the remaining hostages. I'm not sure they can accomplish both. And right now, I think the Biden administration has been on the right track in calling for a ceasefire of at least 6 weeks duration and the release of hostages. You know as well as I, in the world of diplomacy, that if you can get a 6-week ceasefire, all manner of things are possible within 6 weeks. But I think that has to be the imperative, to get the fighting stopped, the violence stopped, paused, focus on the release of the hostages, and then see where it goes from there.
Well, Hamas, I would think, has the same contradictory issues that Israel does. I mean, they can't give up all the hostages or they lose their ability to protect themselves. It seems like conundrum on both sides, or am I missing something?
No, I think you got it exactly. It's what is not going to happen is the immediate return of all the hostages that are still alive. But if there can be an agreement on a temporary ceasefire, and again, we were talking about 6 weeks, that would see the return of some of the hostages, then at least a process is started. And most importantly, the violence is halted, at least temporarily. And obviously, the aim would be to broker an initial pause in fighting and the partial release of hostages to the complete release of hostages and a permanent end of the violence. that's what diplomacy is all about.
Okay. What is your sense of what the Arab nations are doing? Obviously, they have different interests among themselves. They're not uniform at all. But what is your sense in terms of what's going on now in the spring of 2024 of their posture, status, and activity, number one? And similar question vis-a-vis Iran in terms of the war in Gaza.
It's a great question. I think what is most significant about what the Arab states are doing is what they're not doing. There have not been mass popular protests against Israel. We have not seen the countries that have established diplomatic relations with Israel break those relations or even threaten to do so.
Good point.
Only one of those Arab states, and there are now 5 with formal relations with Israel, only one of them, Jordan, has recalled its ambassador. And Jordan has a unique situation with over half of its population of Palestinian origin.
Right.
And of course, we're continuing a conversation with Saudi Arabia about the day after the conflict and the possibility, obviously on pause for the moment, of an eventual establishment of diplomatic relations between Riyadh and Jerusalem. Saudi Arabia has not taken that off the table. So again, it is noteworthy to observe that the Arab reactions, both officially and in terms of popular reactions, again, no mass demonstrations, have thus far been relatively muted. And that underscores, I think, a kind of a sad truth. There is no love lost between Arab states and the Palestinians. We have seen Syria, Jordan, for example, undertake lethal campaigns against Palestinians in the past. I was in Lebanon for the War of the Camps, which was an attack and a siege imposed by Syrian-backed proxies in Lebanon against the Shatila and Borj al-Barajni refugee camps in southern Beirut. That went on for 3 years with the loss of thousands of Palestinian lives at the hands of other Arabs. So again, it's like everything else in the Middle East, it's a complex dynamic. But the Palestinians don't have a lot of friends in the Arab world.
How would you describe the attitude of the Arab states during this war compared to previous conflicts with Israel? I mean, they're different leaders in some cases now. Not every case, but they're generational differences, they're different circumstances.
Yes, there are. I take Egypt, for example, which was in the vanguard of the Arab states in establishing relations with Israel, and it paid dearly for it. When Sadat made his breathtaking trip to Jerusalem, we saw the Camp David process unfold, and then the conclusion of an Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. Virtually all other Arab states broke diplomatic relations with Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
That was then. This is a very different now. And it's a different now in Egypt as well. The thorniest moment, I think, in this whole process between the US and Egypt occurred when Secretary Blinken, early on in the fighting, suggested that perhaps Egypt could permit the temporary refuge in Egypt of Palestinians from Gaza. The Egyptians went ballistic over that. That was a red line for them. There is no significant Palestinian population in Egypt, and they want to keep it that way. It's also noteworthy that the president of Egypt, President el-Sisi, who took power in a military coup, has had a productive relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu over the years. I remember once, a few years ago now, going up to New York for the General Assembly and having a meeting with Sisi, He was late. He bounded into the room and said, I'd like to thank you. And this was not at a time in the relationship. This was during the Obama years when El-Sisi was thanking the U.S. for very much. And I said, well, what for? And he said, well, for the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. We never could have gotten it without you. And it's now the cornerstone of our national security. And he then said, but I also have one regret to express. And what is that? I said, preparing for the worst. I was not prepared for his answer, which was that I have a better relationship with the Prime Minister of Israel than I do with the President of the United States. And indeed, Netanyahu and Sisi have seen eye to eye on issues that have divided sometimes Israel and the U.S. So again, it's a different region, and it's important to bear that in mind as we wrestle with the immediate challenge of this awful conflict in Gaza.
So let's talk about Iran. A few months ago, it seemed to casual observers that they were going to do everything they could to make a bigger mess of this than it is otherwise. In some ways, that doesn't seem to have happened. What's your take on Iran in the current environment with the war in Gaza?
Well, again, I think that's a very perceptive observation. The airways were filled with predictions of cataclysm to come between Iran and its proxies, and not just Israel, but the West, led by the U.S. generally. That hasn't happened. Now, that is not to say it won't. It remains a very volatile situation, but again, it's like the Arab reactions themselves, that what hasn't happened may be more significant than what has. The violence, of course, continues on Israel's northern borders, with both the Lebanese and Israeli sides of the borders now basically no man's lands, with civilian populations evacuated as the exchange of rockets continues. But that hasn't developed into a full-scale conflict. It's also important to notice what isn't happening, or at least isn't happening any longer, in Iraq and Syria. You may recall a couple of months ago, we were looking at a really disturbing series of attacks by Iranian proxy militias on U.S. forces deployed in the area that eventually led to the death of 3 troopers in a remote outpost in Jordan. We responded forcefully more than once and made it clear we would keep on responding. And what's happened? Nothing. Those attacks have basically ceased. You know, Lloyd Austin, our defense secretary, had a great line, and he, as a former Corps commander in Iraq, knows what he's talking about when he said of the Iranian backed militias, they have significant capabilities. I have a lot more.
Gotcha.
And he then demonstrated that by using. So again, it's a dance between the U.S. and Iran. Thus far, I think we have been successful in demonstrating that we will respond forcefully when our troops are exposed to lethal fire, and the Iranians have responded with restraint. Now, again, this whole thing could blow up right after we get off this call. But again, thus far, with the Arabs and with Iran, I've been as impressed, if not more impressed, by what isn't happening than what is.
Very, very interesting. Let's switch over to the longer term. There are theories that say that as a result of the attack on October 7th, and as you say, the effect that's had on the psyche of people in Israel, and then the very strong military response by Israel into Gaza, and the tragedy in Gaza, and the reaction of other people around the world to that tragedy, that this has made the likelihood of a long-term security and peace agreement in the region harder. There are other people who say, no, it's going to make it easier. What is your view about the middle to long-term impact? Or maybe it's just things are going to keep on like this indefinitely. I'd be interested in where you think this goes, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now.
Well, I think this is where the Biden administration, and I am not a consistent fan of their foreign policy by any means, but I think they have got it right on this tragic conflict. To stand with Israel, literally to embrace Israel, as President Biden did in his visit to Jerusalem at the outset of the tragedy, that's been crucial. The voices are being raised ever louder, calling for punitive U.S. action against Israel.
Right.
Well, that I think ignores the enormous trauma that Israel has felt as a result of October 7. The vast majority of Israelis support definitive military action to eliminate any possible threat from Hamas in the future. If we are to ignore that reality, we're going to lose Israeli public opinion, which will have both very negative consequences, short-term and long-term. Right now, I think we are able to be a voice of restraint. The Biden administration has effectively established a red line on a Rafah invasion, which would be catastrophic. But if we are to be seen broadly in Israeli public opinion as having turned against Israel, that's just going to produce a fortress mentality that is going to shove this in the wrong direction, both short term in terms of the way this conflict is waged, with even more casualties among Palestinians, but also more significantly for the longer term. The administration has pressed again for a two-state solution, a viable Palestinian state with adequate security guarantees for Israel. That's going to be a tough sell in Israel under current circumstances. Should we shift our posture to sanction Israel, to cut off arms shipments, or take other punitive measures, it's going to move from a hard lift to an impossible lift. I think both near and long term. So it's important to focus on the Israeli dimension of this crisis as well as the Palestinian and other Arab dimension.
Well, thinking of the Israeli dimension of it, and I've not been in Israel since October 7th, and I've only been to Israel once in my life, so I don't understand Israel as well as you do and most experts do. It would seem as though the suddenness and ferocity of the Hamas attack would both make Israelis angry and feel more insecure, not more secure. So I'm trying to understand your perspective on, does the fact of this whole experience, which may drag on for quite a while, hopefully will not, make Israel more likely politically, internally, to go to a two-state solution, or less likely?
Well, right now, I think there is zero likelihood of any significant support in Israel for a two-state solution. And we're talking after the guns fall silent, after this current crisis is resolved in some manner. The only way that the two-state solution can be kept alive at all, I think, is by a consistent U.S. position that recognizes the enormity of what Israel suffered on October 7 and maintains that strategic alliance. That if Israel feels more isolated, if they feel that their consistently strongest backer in the world over time has turned against them, Jim, this is going to get way worse.
Well, let me ask you the same question on the Arab side. Do you think that this horrendous experience makes it easier or harder for the Arab countries who have not recognized Israel and have not embraced security guarantees to be able to do so?
In the short term, that's the prospect of other Arab states entering into diplomatic relations with Israel is off the table.
Right.
But again, as I argued earlier in our conversation, I think the absence of a really intense negative reaction from states, particularly Saudi Arabia, indicate that the door is still open. And I think that's very important that and again, I would credit the administration with, persistent, intensive diplomacy. Tony Blinken has I've lost track of the number of trips to the region, but he has stayed heavily engaged with Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, and has been working overtime, as has Bill Burns, our CIA director, in trying to broker that agreement between Hamas and Israel for a ceasefire of some limited duration and the beginning of hostage releases. So again, as you know from your own experience, successful diplomacy often has a lot to do with persistence, of just staying engaged, of keeping the contact, even when the going is very difficult, maybe especially when the going is very difficult, and maintaining the relationships, maintaining an atmosphere of trust and of consultation, and using that to build for better days.
And making clear that we're not going away.
And that is crucial. That is absolutely crucial, that the U.S. is engaged for the long term.
This is one area where the at least rhetorical disagreements between the presumptive Republican nominee, former President Trump, and presumptive Democratic nominee, President Biden, they seem to be sort of on the same page, in the sense that if you look at President Trump's record and his rhetoric in terms of obviously being supportive of Israel, but also the Abraham Accords, working with the Arabs, it would seem like, other than some other areas of the world, we'll call it Ukraine and perhaps some other areas, it seems like if I were an Arab leader or I were a Israeli leader, I would feel that I'm not as at much risk of a change in administration as other folks in the world may feel. Does that make sense?
It does, and I hope that's the case. That you're right to draw attention to the Abraham Accords. That was a huge, huge achievement, and I think largely an unexpected one. There wasn't a lot of hype, a lot of preliminary rat-a-tat-tat on the drum sets. It just, boom, there it was. And in one stroke, the number of nations at formal peace with Israel went from 2 to 5. Right. And all three of those newer relationships have shown remarkable resilience in their capacity to withstand the impact of the Gaza conflict. So, and that, of course, was orchestrated by President Trump and his team. Something that I think the professional peace process establishment just hated, and that may be why it hasn't gotten the attention I think that it deserves. But because it was an extraordinary achievement, and as I've noted, Saudi Arabia has not taken off the table the prospect that at a certain time and under certain circumstances it could join that process, and that at a time of cataclysmic fear of our coming election, both at home and abroad, I think you rightly point out to this is one area where there seems to be consistency between the two presumptive candidates on the best way to manage our relationship in the Middle East vis-a-vis Israel and its Arab neighbors.
Let me bring us back before we wrap this up to today and the discussions about a ceasefire. And here I want just to put yourself in the room with the negotiators. What do you think is holding up an agreement, and what do you think will bring an agreement?
Well, I think it's probably easier from an outsider's point of view to talk about the latter point than the former. If you're not actually in the room, it is difficult to know what the give and take of what are, of course, proximity talks can be. Israel and Hamas are not sitting down face to face. You have Egyptians and Qataris as intermediaries, and the U.S. the essence of an agreement, of an initial agreement, would have to be Israeli agreement for a prolonged pause in the conflict. 6 weeks is the figure that's out there. Hamas would have to agree to the release of a significant number of hostages. No one expects they will all be released, but certainly the women and children. And Israel will have to agree to the release of a much greater number of Palestinians. Now, this is all theoretically possible. But the devil is in the details, as it always is. And some of the Hamas demands that we have heard are clearly unacceptable to Israel. Whether those are simply rhetorical flourishes or a more deeply held position, time will tell. I do think, based on my experience in Lebanon back in 1982, when Israel invaded the south and laid siege to Beirut to eliminate the PLO as a threat, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the eventual resolution of that engagement was the safe departure from Beirut of the PLO leadership. And that may be something that all parties are going to have to look at. I'm not sure that the Hamas leadership is quite ready to fight to the death, at least right now. So that could be the ultimate and toughest point in a negotiation here. Whether Israel can bring itself to allow those who were responsible for the October 7 massacre to escape justice, at least in the short term.
That's a very interesting historical point that obviously you were there, so you're very familiar with it. So, Ambassador Crocker, thanks for joining us today. This is Ambassador Jim Rosapep for American Ambassadors Live podcast.
This has been the American Ambassadors Live podcast. To hear more from us, subscribe to the American Ambassadors Live podcast and leave us a review. Tweet us your thoughts on this week's episode and tag us at AMER Ambassadors using the hashtag AmbassadorsLive.